Hi there everyone, I hope you're doing well. For this video, we're going to be talking about Plato's dialogue, the Euthyphro. The Euthyphro is a really fascinating dialogue. It's a really great example of, a kind of what we would call a standard Socratic dialogue, right? What do I mean by that? Well, in general, the Euthyphro is a good representation of what a lot of Plato's writing is about. Especially, there's sort of a period generally thought in Plato's writing that's sort of his Socratic period, right? Here, he's not really concerned with giving his own distinctive philosophical account, and it will turn out that there's a totally different view from Socrates that Plato himself, thinks that he embodies and thinks that he can argue is the truth and all of that, right? Um, but these early dialogues are really focused on the character and the actions of Socrates. Socrates was a philosopher, around 400-ish AD is when the events that we're going to be reading about take place. And Socrates is often thought about as like the patron saint of philosophy, right? Like there are a lot of comparisons between Socrates and Jesus Christ, right? Part of the reason why is because Socrates ends up dying for, essentially martyring himself for the cause of philosophy, right? So philosophers everywhere, ever since, have, maybe that's a little bit of an exaggeration, but philosophers in very many places have sought various kinds of inspiration from Socrates' life, right? And the main events of Socrates' life, especially those that most people are very interested in, are contained in the next series of dialogues that we're going to be covering in this class, right? So the Euthyphro, the Apology, the Crito, and the Phaedo, right? These are all dialogues where sort of the canonical events of Socrates' life really unfold, right? And so we're going to become familiar with Socrates as a figure slowly over the next few weeks. But what's most characteristic of Socrates and his endeavors that is certainly reflected in the Euthyphro is that Socrates is consistently depicted, especially by Plato, as the preeminent philosopher, right? And Plato, in particular, pays a lot of attention to the etymology of the word philosophy, right? Philosophy is a love of wisdom, right? And importantly, you might contrast the position of the philosopher with that of, say, like the sage, for example, right? Sages, they claim to have divine insight and to know things, right? To genuinely not just seek wisdom or something like that, but they claim to actually be wise, right? By contrast, Socrates is continually in the pursuit of wisdom, right? Socrates loved wisdom. He didn't want to hoard it or something like that all to himself. He didn't want to attach his name to some philosophical system or something like that, right? He wasn't trying to be well known or well regarded or even well liked, right? Many depictions of Socrates emphasize that he's sort of ugly and annoying, right? Interesting model for philosophers everywhere, right? But in any case, right, what's sort of characteristic of Socrates is that while there are all these people all around Athens who claim that, hey, I really do have knowledge. I know the way that is. I know how to teach you how to be a politician, how to be well respected, how to, get everything that you want politically, socially, etc., right? And people make promises about their wisdom and indeed get paid for it in various ways, right? There were these people, sophists, who went around ancient Athens, and they were essentially a kind of mix between a lawyer and a teacher. They sought to give people a certain kind of education, but because of the democratic nature of Athens, it was sort of an explicitly political or civil kind of education, right? What the sophists sold is power above everything else. They claimed that they could, ensure that your sons and so on would be well brought up men who are likely to continue your lineage and who will expand, the power of your family and so on and so forth, right? And these were the people that generally were kind of thought to be wise, right? And while these other people are out there sort of like selling essentially wisdom, right? They claim, oh, hey, I figured out, all the secrets to life or whatever, right? I know how to make everyone follow everything that you ever say, and I, know how to, make you the most appealing orator and so on, right? Socrates is none of that. Socrates didn't charge anyone to speak with him like these sophists did. Socrates would even pay people in context for them to speak to him, right? He doesn't see his role as educating other people, like he has wisdom and he's going to give it to you, but he's actually seeking an education for himself, right? And one of the things that's sort of like the aspect of physical humor or something like that, right, is that most of these people that are sort of like seeking an education in this way, right, they're young men. They are adolescents growing into adulthood, right? They're often described as like getting their first beard, etc. These fellow students also seeking wisdom. But Socrates is very old, right? Yeah, all of the events that we're going to be examining about Socrates' life happen when he is very much an old man, right? And he's taking on this sort of kiddish, naive point of view where, he takes people very, very seriously, right? They'll claim, oh, I know the rules of right and wrong, I know true wisdom, etc., right? And Socrates will be like, oh my God, that's so great. I'm so happy about that. I'm so happy I get to learn from someone so wise, etc., etc. But then, of course, always what happens next is that Socrates devastates this person that, claimed to be wise and claimed to have all this kind of knowledge, right? Socrates, in this kind of earnest way of wanting to know his own, wanting to know philosophy for himself, always sorts of starts to question the account that is given to him by others, right? And he reveals it to be inadequate usually, and typically what happens, there are exceptions because Plato is very, very rich, but the way that these dialogues usually end is it ends in aporia, right? Once again, we have this sort of alpha primitive here, right? Aporia, right? And what that means is that there's no place to go, right? There's no obvious next step, right? We maybe haven't figured out whatever is the object of investigation in that dialogue. And the conclusion that you're supposed to reach is like sort of left to the reader, right? There's not really like a whole lot of a positive account that comes out of this. That's going to change in some of Plato's later writings, where he's more interested in giving a positive account of his own philosophy. But in these earlier Socratic dialogues, it's really more about Socrates and Socrates' mode of questioning and its relationship to philosophy, to the truth, right, to the pursuit of wisdom, and how Socrates can be sort of a model for us all, right? Okay, so really I want us to focus on two central quotes, right? One occurs at 6D, The other occurs, oh no, I didn't write this down, at 10a. 10a, right? Um, Before we get into either of them, though, just a little bit more context, right? So the Euthyphro is dialogue that's normally first read in the sequence, and it sort of drops you in, in the middle, right? There's no introduction to Socrates or all these other characters, right? It's just sort of like, boom, you're in the agora in ancient Athens, right? The agora is like a marketplace, but more than being somewhere like a marketplace that we would think of, I think that makes us think of like the flea market or like a stockbrokers or something like that, right? That's not really what's going on. The marketplace, the agora, is more like a public forum, right? It's a place where people can go to kind of like just hang out, and people are selling their wares, right? It's closer to the mall or something like that, honestly, than it is to a flea market, right? Because there's very many people present and only some of them are really engaging in this kind of economic activity. A lot of the other ones are just kind of talking, right? And this is where a lot of the sort of deep philosophical conversations in Athens takes place, right? And importantly, too, we get a lot of background setup about Socrates, right? What do we learn? Well, he's hanging outside the courthouse, right? And why is he hanging outside the courthouse? Well, because he's been accused of something, right? In particular, he's been accused of corrupting the youth. He's been accused of being impious, right? Not believing in the gods. And he's accused of, essentially, we're going to see, being a sophist, being one of these sort of like peddlers of wisdom, right? And the next dialogue that we're going to be examining, the Apology, it's going to be Socrates' in-depth response to all of these charges, right? These are mostly brought up as sort of like background material in this dialogue. So Socrates is kind of hanging around and he's like, oh man, somebody's saying that I'm acting wrong, that I'm teaching people the wrong thing, I'm acting the wrong way, and education is so important, right? So they must really know something that I don't know, right? And so Socrates sort of views it as an opportunity to learn from his accuser how it is that, he should be treating other people, right? And he runs into this guy, Euthyphro, right? And Euthyphro is sort of like a typical interlocutor for Socrates, right? Because he's kind of arrogant. He's like, oh, what are you doing here, Socrates? And Socrates is like, oh, no, I'm getting charged, right? I'm getting charged because they say I'm impious, right? And then you have Euthyphro be like, well, I was actually here because I was prosecuting my own father for killing a slave, right? So I'm really, really, really pious, meaning loved by the gods, divine, something like that, right? And then Socrates goes, oh, great, you're pious. Okay, well then you can tell me what piety is, right? What is it to be pious? What is it to be loved by the gods? And Euthyphro does what a lot of characters in Socratic dialogues do. He tries to give an example instead of giving a general form or account, right? He's like, well, what I'm doing right now is pious, right? Prosecuting your father, that's pious, right? And this leads us into the first quote that we want to examine, right? In part of what Socrates says to Euthyphro here is he says, bear in mind then that I did not bid you tell me one or more of the many pious actions, right? So he says, I'm not looking for an example of piety, right? But I'm looking for the form itself that makes all pious actions pious, right? I mean, just think about it this way, right? Socrates is trying to think about whether he's acting piously, right? Learning that Euthyphro is, pious or whatever, that doesn't get him anywhere. It doesn't resolve his question about whether or not he's behaving correctly. And it wouldn't be enough for him to be like, oh, am I acting like Euthyphro or something like that? Because, like, other people might, for example, prosecute their fathers unjustly, right? And what Socrates is looking for is the general form that makes pious actions pious, right? And this idea of forms is going to be something that we continue to develop and think about and talk about a lot over the next several weeks as we deal with Plato more in depth, right? And so I've drawn out a little kind of diagram here, right, where there's big blue capital P, and there are all of these very many lowercase purple P's, right, lowercase. What is the point of this diagram? Well, what Socrates is saying is, hey, there are very many examples of actions that are pious, right? There are very many examples of actions that are moral. For example, too, maybe it's moral to give your brother money or something like that, right? But learning about the particulars, learning about, you know, all the things that might be considered pious, morally good or something like that, right? It doesn't tell you about the thing that makes them all particulars of that thing. So, like, why is giving to your brother, in this example, a good thing rather than a bad thing? Why is prosecuting your father considered pious, right? In killing a slave or something like that is considered impious, right? And so what we really have is a one over many problem. We need an account, a logos, of the one form that goes over many instances, right? And this is the thrust of both Socrates and Plato's thinking, that there are all these examples of pious things or morally good things, for example, right? But what the philosopher seeks is the one form, the nature of piety itself, that all of the particulars are said to participate in, right? If something is beautiful, you watch a beautiful movie, right? Then Plato says that it participated in the form of beauty, right? And so you should be able to give an account as to why it, you know, participates in beauty rather than participates in ugliness or, you know, something else, right? So this serves as kind of an explanation for why it is that Plato and Socrates are constantly going to be asking about the form of stuff, the form of piety, the form of the good, right? And this account really motivates the next aspect I'd like to discuss, which is the Euthyphro dilemma, right? This comes up on passage 10a, right? Socrates, in the passage we just examined, right? He's like, hey, you need to give me something that is the general form of piety, something that is appropriate to cover all of these very many instances, right? And then Euthyphro gives him an answer that is at least of the right form, right? And then what Euthyphro says is to be pious is to be loved by the gods, right? Things that the gods love, those things are pious, right? But then Socrates nails him with what is known as the Euthyphro dilemma, right? Socrates says, consider this. Is the pious being loved because it is pious? Or is it pious because it is being loved by the gods, right? That is really subtle, and it can be kind of difficult to understand at first, right? But the question is like this, right? We might translate it into more contemporary terms that are easier for us. Say, for example, that God loves human beings, right? God is happy when human beings are doing well, right? what Socrates is asking, right? Does God love human beings because, like, there's some reason, like human beings are morally good, it's morally a better universe when there are happier, maybe more human beings in it, right? Um, or is it that it's simply because God decides, right? There's no further reason. God could decide to make it totally the opposite way, right? To instead love human suffering and to want human beings to exist in the world least of all, right? The question that Socrates is asking is God constrained in this way, right? Is there something about being pious that makes the God love it, right? Or is it just sort of an arbitrary decision, right? Where you could love, say, helping people, but you could just as easily love hurting people, right? It's not rooted in anything deeper than that, right? And we might think of this as kind of like a fork, right? This is why it's a dilemma. There are two options, and neither of which is really good for Euthyphro, right? So let's consider the blue option, the one that comes first. Is the pious being loved because it is pious, right? If this is true, then the God's love is caused by the piety, right? And not vice versa. The other way has it, right, that the piety is simply caused by being loved, right? And so you might frame it as a question about the direction of the causal relationship. Does God love things because they're pious? Or does God love things for no reason whatsoever, right? And then we just call those things that God loves pious, right? So what is the problem with the blue option? Well, the problem with the blue option is if this is true, then Euthyphro's definition is no good, right? Because the gods love things because it's pious, right? So in other words, the piety is not defined by the gods loving it, and it does not serve as a good example of this general form of piety, right? On this, if the blue option is true, then God's loving the thing is actually irrelevant to whether or not it's pious, right? And so you arrive at a stance you might call moral realism, right? You think that piety or morality are these rules that really exist and they're out there in the world, right? And when, say in your standard theological perspective, when God loves human beings, right, it's because it's actually morally good, right? God acts for reasons, right? But if this is true, then God's wishes, loves, desires, etc. are irrelevant to the account, right? To be pious is not to be loved by the gods, it's to be worthy of love by the gods, right? By contrast, this pink option, right? If you go with the pink option, you just say, okay, well, we're just going to call everything that God loves pious, right? Then, on this account, you kind of have moral anti-realism, right? By which I mean just that our decision to call things good and bad is just convention, and we can just change those conventions, right? So God right now thinks that saving human beings is good, but God could just as well decide, nah, I don't care for them, right? It's no longer good, right? And this account is also a problem, right? Because then being loved by the gods is something arbitrary and capricious, right? And we don't have something like a general form of piety that can inform us about all of the particular instances, right? Euthyphro seems to not understand. He gets frustrated with Socrates, as Socrates' interlocutors often do, and just kind of storms out, right? And it's just like, whatever, I know I'm pious, I don't need you, right? And so we get the sort of traditional ending for the Socratic dialogue, right? Aporia, right? We didn't come to an account of piety, right? But we maybe came to understand what it is that we're looking for when we give an account of something, right? And we also learned particular pitfalls, right? In this case, the pitfall was in trying to make the general form of piety, trying to specify that as being loved, right? Being loved by someone, whether that's a god or a human being, right? Because then you have the question of what motivates that love, right? Why do we flock to morally good things and not to morally bad things, and so on, right? And so, with the Euthyphro, we learn some important lessons, but we do not arrive at a general account. The next dialogue, the apology, this will be, where Socrates arrives in court. He's heard, his prosecutors, what they have to say, and he now speaks in his defense about why he believes that his actions as a philosopher are just. Right? Very exciting stuff. I hope that you all tune in and enjoy that video as well. I hope you're having a great week. Thanks so much for listening. Have a good one.